Today we're going to be discussing the iPod at the Tipping Point article and also the war between Blu-ray and HD DVD for format supremacy. So first, let's talk about the iPod MP3 player adoption at the Tipping Point article from 2004, which is the time that the iPod was making the jump across the chasm that we see in diffusion of innovations theory and becoming adopted by the early majority. And so the tipping point, as we define it, is a point at which technology becomes adopted into the mainstream. So in 2004, the iPod was getting to that point where it was becoming mainstream. It wasn't just a niche item anymore. So let's go through the umbrella model and see what factors at each level of that umbrella model led the iPod to become an innovation that became an institution. First, we want to look at the individual user level. So if we look at the individual user for the iPod, we note that it is a very individual medium, but it allows you to be your own disc jockey. So you don't have to listen to commercials, you don't have to put up with songs that you may not like as well as other songs as you would if you were listening to the radio. You can set up your own playlist and listen to the songs that you choose that you want to hear. So that was a very big selling point for the iPod. The hardware-software aspect of the iPod also was something that is necessary for an innovation to cross into the mainstream, and that was it was easy to use. The iPod had very few buttons, had very few directions that you had to learn in order to operate it, which made it easier for people who might have been apprehensive about adopting it to take it on. Next, the organizational infrastructure for the iPod has caused it to be more than just a music player. It's also a way to purchase music. Through the iTunes interface, you can download music right onto your iPod, you can download audiobooks, and with the introduction of the video iPod, you can download television and even movies now right onto your iPod, right through the interface that you use to manage your music. Finally, the social system or economic system relationships to the iPod with the diffusion of innovations model is it allows everyone to play. The iPod is relatively cost effective and got that way in 2004, so it let the people who were less certain about it not have to spend a lot of money in order to acquire it, which, as we saw, was one of the main things for the people later in the diffusion of innovations adoption curve. So let's look at some of the characteristics of adopters that we see from the diffusion of innovations curve and see if those applied to the iPod. So evidence, one portion of evidence is age differences. And we saw that 19% of people under 30 had adopted the iPod, whereas just 14% of those over 30. So the younger people were more willing to innovate. We also saw that higher disposable income made a difference. And so 24% of those people that made $75,000 a year or more had an iPod, whereas only 10% of the people that made $30,000 to $75,000 had acquired an iPod. And if we go under 20,000, under 30,000, we see 6% was all of those who were less than 30,000 that had iPods at this time. So we can see income did make a difference. More evidence that shows that the iPod at the tipping point came from diffusion of innovations theory. Higher media exposure was found in those people that had it because they were internet users, and the internet users were 4 times as likely to have the iPod as non-internet users. We also saw that people with broadband access were more likely to have the iPod. 23% of people who had broadband at the time had it, whereas only 9% of people who had dial-up had it. We also saw that education was a factor, and those that had 6 or more years online experience are twice as likely as those who came online within the last 3 years. So the more familiar with the online experience, the more they felt educated about it, the more likely they were to have the iPod. So we can see that many of the diffusion of innovations characteristics hold up in the real world when we look at the iPod adoption. The other example that we'll look at today is Blu-ray versus HD DVD. And we found out that only one of these was able to survive after a few years of competition. That is due to one level of our umbrella model, the economic system level. People don't want to pay for 2 things, 2 technologies to do the same thing. They want access to all the content with the same device and won't pay for two different technologies. They won't have both a Blu-ray player and an HD DVD player. So it was inevitable that one would win out. Now if you look at the relative advantages of each, there are some for each format. First, for Blu-ray, it had a larger storage capacity. Blu-ray was able to store 25 to 50 gigabytes versus only 15 to 30 gigabytes for an HD DVD. What you had to ask yourself if you were making the choice was, does this matter to you, or is 15 to 30 gigabytes already enough? 84% of movies made in 2005 were made by studios that had announced support for Blu-ray. So at the time, in 2005, it was a lot easier to get a movie on Blu-ray than it was on HD DVD because the limitations of the offerings of HD DVD were much greater. So this meant that HD DVD had to figure out a way to keep up by either marketing different types of uses for their technology or trying to compete. HD DVD did have relative advantages. It was cheaper to make, and also it came out first, so it was available longer than Blu-ray was. If you ask the experts at the time of who will win, Lance Ulanoff from PC Magazine in 2005 said that Blu-ray was doomed. He said that HD DVD's head start was going to win the day. And he said, in our lightning-fast, high-tech world, 2 months is like the first 2 lengths of a 4-length horse race, the 2-month head start that HD DVD had. Well, from what we know more than Lance Ulanoff, because we know that diffusion of innovations theory doesn't always hold up in terms of best also equaling first out.